people that I like. There is...
And one that you don't.
Guess
and
who?
everybody will have to guess by the end of the stream. So this is going to be a fun guessing game. So we have, C. Derrick Varn, who I've known the longest, although I guess that doesn't really tell you which bucket he goes in. And our producer, Jordan Dubin. And we have This is Revolutions, Deep State Kuba, phoning in from an undisclosed location in the Far East. How you guys doing today?
Pretty good. Excited for this, actually.
I did not eat anyone's spleen. That was a victory.
Technically, I'm doing well tomorrow.
Oh,
Ooh.
future Kuba.
Yeah. Kuba is a man of the future.
Jordan,
How are you, Ben? I feel like no one ever asks you that.
Aw,
Let me take that upon myself.
wow. I'm good. Yeah, guts. It is a beautiful day here in Southern California. Guts doing picked up an in-person class in the fall at a university in Burbank, so went over there today to do some stuff for that.
Nice.
This is very off-brand. I'm drinking on a when I drink on a stream, it's usually just like whiskey or beer, but this
Kombucha.
mezcal margarita I just made.
Hell
So
yeah.
it's
Kombucha.
got that last little bit of Southern California summertime. Got
Yeah.
to take advantage.
I am a teetotaler on air because otherwise I would attack your audience.
I mean, I guess that all depends on what they've done to have it come in.
We'll see.
They know.
Varn's taking the offensive realist position this evening.
Fair enough. Jordan, with the most substantially sized drink on the panel, you found this video for us. So tell us about that which we are about to watch.
Okay, well, I should probably have it open somewhere. I watched it earlier today, gave it a brief run through beforehand, but this is basically a debate between a politician and an academician in the realm of international relations and geopolitics, specifically on the war in Ukraine and touching a little bit on China as well. One is a European politician, the other an American, a name that a lot of people are probably familiar with, except when Ben says it, because he says Mearsheimer. Yeah, that would be.
I know there's the S and H and the M, and otherwise I get very lost in that, man.
That's okay. Well, this is a debate that's held in Norway, and I think that the person that introduces them, as well as the moderator, has a little bit of a struggle with his name as well. So you're in good company, at the very least. But we shall see. It's kind of long, but it is really well-structured debate compared to other ones that we've done in the recent past. And I think that we'll cover a lot of ground. None of these people are socialists by any stretch of the imagination, but we'll hear things that we've heard before. And I think it'll be fun. Everyone here is pretty well suited to this conversation.
Yeah, whenever this comes up, I always recommend this interview that I think Bronco maybe did with Danny Bester, Jack, and then just about a year ago, called How Should the Left Think About Realism in Foreign Policy, which I think does a nice job of breaking down those parts of what the people we're usually thinking of with the realists are saying that are sort of congenial to what we think, and those that aren't, and it's worth checking out. I should also say, just to set this up a little bit, that speaking of Jacobins, I was watching some of last night's Republican debate because at one point I thought I might be writing something for them about it, and they ended up putting me on Trump Tucker duty instead. So I'll be writing about that instead of the debate. But in any case, both the Republican debate last night and the Trump-Tucker sit-down last night in lieu of Trump participating in the debate were really notable for the focus on anti-China hawkery. That is pretty clearly the 8 people who are on the Republican debate stage, and then the most significant person who wasn't. That is very clearly one of the things that they most strongly agree on. That there was a moment in the Trump-Tucker sit-down.
It sounds so weird. Trump-Tucker. It sounds like a strange disease.
Sure.
Trump Tucker Trucker Pucker.
That's right.
The Trump Trucker Fuddrucker debate, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
Bloodsucker.
Yeah, that's also not inappropriate. The Swanson. But there's a point where Tucker asked him that. I think it's starting out. It might be something about Cuba. Anyway, they're talking about various Latin America things, and Tucker indignantly asks, and this is an exact quote, "How is it that China is allowed to do imperialism in our hemisphere?"
Well, then we're going to get into the Monroe Doctrine a little bit today as well. I think we'll be able to broach that question.
Only we are allowed to do that.
Yeah.
But like in the main Republican debate last night, like quite a bit of the like one of the big things there's disagreement about, as you imagine, was Ukraine. But I don't know if any of you guys saw any of the debate, but like the way that the Ukraine disagreement was processed was over which side of that debate was like more sort of credibly belligerent against China. That the Nikki Haley, Mike Pence sort of view was Chris Christie was like, oh, well, you need to stand with Ukraine to show China that they need to leave Taiwan alone, send a strong message. And the Vivek, I always want to mispronounce that, but I remember his helpful advice that rhymes with cake, and I don't. Vivek Ramaswamy, his big argument was that the war in Ukraine is actually bad because it leads Russia into alliance with the real danger, which is China. And so the one thing everybody agrees on is that it's very, very important that we have as hawkish a posture as at all possible toward China.
Yeah, this is a funny thing. It takes a war in the Ukraine to end the Sino-Soviet split. Also, the end of the Soviet Union helps. So.
Sure.
Yeah.
Fair enough. What?
Yeah, the new Russo, Sino-Russo, Rossino, the new Rossino alliance has a completely different ideological flavor, and
as in no ideological flavor.
Yeah, as in vanilla, right? I guess natural, as if it were a yogurt, and that also carries over into the level of integration that you see between Russia and China in fields other than hard power, defensive posturing, and certain strategic forms of economic integration, in that Russia's just seen as another foreign country in China. And similarly, there's no particular warmth or solidarity on the Russian side towards China either. It's very much kind of, well, all the other potential dance partners paired up before we got here. So I guess we're stuck with each other.
Something like that. Yeah, it's going to be interesting in the conversation as well, because of course, with the Republican stage and American China war hawkery, it's a different story for Europe. When we get into conversations about polarity and who the main, regional actors are, Europe is kind of the ugly girl at the dance, and there may well be reason for them to want to continue to trade with China and to turn to them in ways that will make America kind of unhappy in the future. So Let's get into it. EU, NATO, Russo, Sino, Ukraino.
I mean, it's a
Us.
brick house, right?
Yeah.
Fair enough. All right, let's get going. So in about 12 minutes, I think this is where the actual debate's going to start.
Yes, that was Kirsty Flurmster or something, and she wasn't very interesting.
Swedish diplomat chef.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Kersti.
Can we turn it up a
Dear
little?
audience, I'm honored and delighted to have the privilege to moderate the Holberg Debate of 2022, organized by the Holberg Prize.
She was really good as a supporting character in Veep.
Bergen. But while the city is bright and cheerful, the subject of tonight's debate is far from it. It is dark and gloomy.
Like Norway
Because
in
we
winter.
live in dangerous times. This year, war on land between nations returned to continental Europe. Russia's aggressive military assault on Ukraine is a watershed, a monumental event in the history of modern Europe. And we are still struggling to gauge all the effects that this war of aggression will have for the future of Europe
all
and
the
the world at
effects?
large.
Gauge.
Yep.
Simultaneously, other dark clouds are on the horizon. The rivalry in technological, political, economic, and military terms between the giants of the world, the US and China, is gaining traction. But even when war and geopolitical rivalry is upon us, and it is very clear to us who is a friend and who is a foe, public debate must take place. And the Holberg Debate this year ventures into this complex and sensitive landscape, asking whether fear will keep us safe, and what do the current geopolitical crisis mean for the power of deterrence and the prospects of a new global security order. As the journalist and grand strategist Walter Lippmann once observed, where all think alike, no one thinks very much. On behalf of the Holberg Prize, I'm therefore delighted to present to the public two distinguished speakers who do not think alike. One is a scholar of politics, and one is a craftsman of politics. One is American, and one is European. One is a proponent of the school of realism, the other a firm believer in liberal traditions. Our two speakers have expressed views in stark contrast to each other, notably on Russia and her war on Ukraine. The American guest is, and realist scholar is John Mearsheimer. Professor John Mearsheimer is the R. Wendell Harrison
Okay, I'm
Distinguished
sure there
Service
should be
Professor.
there's somewhere.
There's a Schmeimer in there somewhere.
He graduated from
Yeah,
West Point in
pretty sure
1970 and
yeah,
served
yes.
5 years in the US Air Force. Mearsheimer has also been a research fellow at the Brookings Institution and Council of Foreign Relations in New York. The European politician is Karl Bildt, former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Sweden. Karl Bildt has also a distinguished international career. Among others, he was the EU Special Envoy to the former Yugoslavia, High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina, and UN Special Envoy to the Balkans. He also was a co-chair of the Dayton Peace Conference. Bildt is currently co-chair of the European Council of Foreign Relations.
We've got two CFR guys
We
here.
will start the debate by
Interestingly.
hearing opening remarks from both speakers.
To be
And I
fair,
just want to remind the
as soon
audience
as Ben
that,
sells enough
under
books,
the
he's getting
that
invited.
they still have the opportunity to send in questions for the speakers. And since we are in Europe, and this is Karl Bildt's turf, we first give the floor to him. The floor is yours.
Seems so unfair.
Karl.
Thank you for those kind words of introduction, and it's truly a pleasure to be here in Bergen. I've come not too long. Professor Mearsheimer had come a long way, but I think we both look forward to this particular debate. And let's be clear, we have entered more dangerous times. That certainly applies to the global order, or perhaps the lack thereof. But it applies, of course, in particular to the situation that we are faced with in this part of the world in our Europe. In the American debate, the focus has always been, or has often been, on the risk of an armed confrontation with a rising China, notably over the future status of Taiwan, and that has loomed large. And policies have been oriented and are oriented towards trying to contain that and slow down the rise of Chinese power in different domains. But here in our Europe, we are since 10 months in the largest military conflict this part of the world has seen since 1945, with no end in sight and with consequences that will last decades. We did, after all, manage to secure some sort of peace during the long decades of the Cold War. In half of Europe, it was the peace of the graveyard. We were in the lucky part. And perhaps the recognition that war in Europe in those days could have led and could have taken us all into nuclear Armageddon played an important part in bringing stability during those long, dark decades. But then the Soviet Union and its wider empire, under the weight of its own failure, collapsed more than 3 decades ago. And the task for particular policy practitioners like myself since then has been to try to build an order that could not only secure peace and security, but hopefully also an element of freedom and prosperity for every part of our continent. And it is these efforts that are now under such a mortal threat from the military aggression initiated by Vladimir Putin 10 months ago. Europe hasn't seen anything since when Adolf Hitler in September 1939 launched his all-out attack against Poland. And there are important similarities between the two cases. In both cases, it was war started by a personal decision of a dictator that didn't really feel any constraints whatsoever. In both cases, it was war started by dictators driven by some sort of vision derived of history of what they wanted to achieve. Hitler wanted to get rid of independent Poland. It was an unnecessary creation of the Versailles Peace Treaty. Putin wants to get rid of Ukraine as an independent entity. He describes this as an unnecessary mistake and creation by, of all people, Vladimir Lenin. Hitler, of course, then continued. When he attacked and occupied Norway, it was described as absolutely necessary to safeguard the security interests of his greater Germany. We know how it all ended. But we don't know how this horrible war will end. It is indeed horrible. We have several hundreds of thousands of soldiers engaged in combat. We have more than 1,000, as a matter of fact, 1,300 kilometers of front line. We have waves after waves of missiles against the civilian infrastructure of the entire Ukrainian nation. We have the greatest number of people displaced or forced to flee of any conflict in any part of the world during the last few decades. The Ukrainians are determined to fight for their freedom. You can't really blame them. And they are more so determined with every new missile and every new bomb that strikes them. But Vladimir Putin is unlikely to back down from seeking to dismember, control, and subdue Ukraine. He has described it several times as a life and death struggle. In all probability, it is a life and death struggle for him. He is unlikely, in my opinion, or he is likely, in my opinion, to escalate as long as he can until he runs out of possibilities and until he collapses. But let's look at the principles if we are to search for new stability. There are two principles that I consider absolutely fundamental for the security of our continent. The first is obviously that aggression should never be tolerated. The Nuremberg and Tokyo trials after the Second World War considered aggression to be the ultimate international crime. Every other war crime derives from the crime of aggression. And the second principle that I consider fundamental is that borders should be respected and should never be altered by force. Most of the borders of Europe have been drawn by blood during past centuries. Not all of them are entirely logical. Sometimes the past still creates emotions and tensions. But if you open up the issue of borders, if you allow one country to dismember another country, one country taking one big, taking over parts of a smaller, you will open up a Pandora's box of true horrors for all of Europe. These are not only principles of international law, but they are primarily, I would argue, principles derived from the very bitter history of Europe. But they are, of course, also principles that resonate strongly across the world. Faced with the Russian aggression, in two landmark decisions, the UN General Assembly, with first 141 and then 144 votes in favor, endorsed these principles. Only 5, I would classify them as outcast nations, voted against. So when we support Ukraine today, it is not only supporting the right of its freedom and independence, but also the support for upholding these principles that are fundamental to the security of all of our European nations. Aggression must never be tolerated. Borders must be respected. Hitler, as you might remember, had all sorts of arguments for invading Poland. He considered it much too close in alliance, as a matter of fact, with Britain and France. He didn't like its treatment of the German minorities. He considered the entire Versailles settlement, Polish corridor and all of that unfair to Germany. And Putin also marshals argument against Ukraine. He doesn't like them, to put it mildly, wanting deeper integration with the European Union and indeed NATO. He bitterly regrets and opposes the departure of former President Yanukovych. He certainly don't like his talk about colored revolutions and democracy. He thinks Russia has been mistreated by the Americans. But nothing of this, be it right or be it wrong, gave neither Hitler nor Putin any thought whatsoever the right to invade Poland or invade Ukraine. And let's be clear, true peace in Europe can't be restored until this aggression has been rolled back and Ukraine has been secured as a democracy freely able to choose its own path for the future. And this can't be achieved until Russia has given up its imperial ambition and focused its energies on building a functioning nation state. As long as it is dragged away by an imperial temptation, it will never be able to develop in harmony, peace, and security with the rest of Europe. And with 140 million people, 11 time zones, and vast natural resources, it doesn't really need an empire in order to be successful. We want to live in peace with a prosperous and stable Russia. I do believe that representative rule, constitutional order, and rule of law would be hugely beneficial for that country. But ultimately, that's up to them to decide. But Putin's aggression means that there's now a fundamental and indeed dangerous uncertainty as to the future of Russia. His war has already failed to reach its objective. But where is Russia some years from now? Will it be in internal chaos and conflict? Will it be on an even more militaristic regime? Or will there be Alexei Navalny competing in free and fair election? No one knows. But one thing we know, this war and its consequences will be with us for a long time. The entire order between the rivers Vistula and Volga is in flux. In our immediate part of the world, Finland and Sweden will soon enter NATO. Denmark has given up its reservation against security and defense dimensions of the European Union. NATO will further enhance its forward presence in the Baltic countries. There are 20,000 more US soldiers on European soil than just a year ago. All countries are increasing their defense expenditure. And NATO and EU will move closer together. The one, a military alliance, the other, a security alliance. In my opinion, the future security of Europe will be a function of the security of Ukraine. A secure Ukraine will create the conditions for stability and peace in Europe, and also for Russia to be able to develop as a great nation state. A destroyed, a dismembered, a divided, and a distraught Ukraine will only generate chaos and conflict for years to come. Today, it's a brutal battle on the plains of the east of Europe. People in their hundreds, perhaps thousands, are dying on a weekly or daily basis. Sometime in the future, the days of diplomacy must certainly come, but we are clearly not there yet. But then, those days of diplomacy must be based on the fundamental principles I have mentioned. The peace and stability of Europe must be based on them. And the peace and stability of Europe is, of course, also should be a global concern. Twice in the last century, strife and conflict in Europe brought war to all of the globe. And there are, as I'm sure we'll debate, numerous other issues as well. There is more global disorder than order. The rivalry between the US and China must be handled. Responsible competition is the slogan, the catchphrase that is used in Washington today. And I hope the same phrase can be used in Beijing as well. The power balance is indeed shifting. China will be the largest economy in the world, with growing naval and now also nuclear capabilities. And both nations are in a desperate race to control the technologies of the future. They know that that is where power ultimately lies. Europe, having to handle the brutal war, sits in between these competing global powers. It does consist of nations that are small and some that don't yet understand that they are small. And we are the European Union. We are a civil, a trading, an economic, and in increasing respects also security power. In its way, you can say that the European Union is a hybrid power, able to handle hybrid threats. But it is certainly not a military power. It can, most particularly, only handle the nuclear might of Russia through its alliance with the United States. Nuclear deterrence remains an unavoidable, perhaps somewhat unpleasant, but unavoidable foundation of our security. And the overall security agenda as we look ahead is indeed both dense and tense, preventing nuclear proliferation and war, containing the unavoidable disorders of the greater Middle East, facilitating all of the consequences of the rapid demographic rise of Africa, handling the security implications of climate change, notably in the Arctic, not too far from here, securing a safe entry into the digital age of artificial intelligence and quantum computing. It's a tall order, perhaps taller than any political generation has faced for quite a long time. But for us, in this part of the world, here in our Europe, securing the future of Ukraine is the foundation for everything else. Thank you.
I'm so confused by that phrase, our Europe.
I really do think it's a bit to reestablish the Swedish Empire.
No, I get it. The idea is to appeal to a kind of small seed civic patriotism around Europeans being like, we Germans are not a warlike people, right? We're a civil, trading, open group of societies that are, we like Eurovision and IKEA, and nobody could possibly object to the little prosperous social democratic life that we've built for ourselves. Please don't look at any of the protests or at anything going on in the streets. Please don't look at any of the human and other wreckage washing up on the Mediterranean or French and British shores. Just concentrate on our aging pop cultural engine and cool walkable architecture.
Right. Yeah. You'd think that he was like Belgian, the way he was so obsessed with dismemberment, but that was interesting. Of course, I also really enjoy the picture of Holberg, like the
graphic.
Yeah.
Like the Dürer print style.
Exactly. It looks like the ghost of nuclear war future.
Yeah.
Just staring on.
My anti-European streak is getting stronger the longer we listen to this guy. I'm like, bring the Eurasian hordes. I'm on their side.
Right. Well, it's interesting to hear him speak about the demographic issues of Africa as well. Just throw that in there. Something that we have to deal with as Europe.
Yeah,
I started counting factual claims. One about the opposition of Russia to Ukraine during the European Union, which is frankly false, both in 2022 and in 2012 and 13. There's a real sentence where he mentions Yanukovych, which says a lot and nothing, which is not to say that that Russia is innocent of all goings on in 2013, but that is a dramatically oversimplified presentation that could only serve, I don't know, it whiffs of an agenda. I mean, and it is interesting that we are now in this with the Swedes, and all our Scandinavian, peacenik friends, who are rediscovering their love of NATO and the bomb.
Well, there's no zeal like that of the new convert, and the Swedes and Finns are to some extent the most enthusiastic new NATO partners that you could hope for. It's an alliance which has lost much of its luster for some of the older members, but
including the core founder. Yeah.
And this is true, and also, he completely glosses over the existence of anti-Atlanticist, anti-European sentiment within the West, right? As though there was an unproblematic consensus around this kind of Atlantic Council, EU plus NATO vision for what Europe means, not just institutionally, but kind of ideologically. As though these were intrinsically liberal institutions and they went hand in glove with all the good civil libertarian, social democratic stuff, and couldn't just be repurposed towards revanchist ends or be engines of a kind of cutthroat, bureaucratic authoritarianism. Right? He says that he wants to see representative government in Russia. Mm-hmm. Well, there's a strong argument that the way that Europe works is you get better, tighter rule of law and more effective continental organization and coordination precisely at the expense of local self-governance. Right? Ask the Hungarians. Right? Ask the Freedom Party in Austria how democratic our Europe is, or how this Europe is.
I mean, the lack of democratic oversight in the EU is notorious, and it's one of the things that the European right brings up that I am actually sympathetic to. You know?
And it's funny because it's one of the for me, it's a feature, not a bug, right? Like if you're going to have effective governance on economic issues, on sort of the structural foundations of collective life, materially, socially, across 500 million people, then you're going to need to do something about this self-government nonsense.
You're going to need to do some sort of centralization.
Precisely.
That's true. You know, whether it's a, democratic form of centralization or not is a little bit of a different question. And
that famous democratic centralism.
Yeah, it all works out. But like, this is something, I mean, Varn said this is one of the things that European rightists bring up he's sympathetic to, me too. But I mean, I'd also say it's something that European liberals often sort of grudgingly acknowledge in a weird way that sort of deprives anybody involved of any sort of agency in setting things up this way. It's like the democracy gap. Like, this is just some sort of strange, naturally occurring phenomenon in the construction of European institutions. And, and I would just really quickly say, I mean, like, how you think about it in the feature bug spectrum might to a certain extent depend on like how much you're holding out hope for something good to happen. I mean, I think that in the I think the Greece example is pretty instructive there about how this would go if any like serious left parties actually took power in any of these countries.
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right about that. The one thing I would add is it is the accomplished fact to naturalize the situation of the EU Constitution. And while, yes, there could be a democratic vision for Europe of a real republic of republics of the European continent. I refuse to actually give it that but whatever. That could exist, but it does not exist. And the reason why it doesn't exist is economic, because there's no way you're going to get agreement of all those zones to do the neoliberal integrationist policy that the EU has done since the end of the Bretton Woods system, effectively. So, and they know that. I mean, like, that's the elephant in the room. Like, that's why, the EU made sure no member state could have currency sovereignty, including Germany, even though, I'm going to be somewhat offensive here, but I've always viewed the EU as like the backdoor mixture of the French Empire and the Fourth Reich. Like, it is what it is in this scenario. So, I'd like to hear Kuba respond to me as a slightly more sanguine on Europe person than me.
I was just smiling while you were saying that because you say sovereignty the way that Michael Brooks always used to. But anyway, go on, Kuba.
So, first of all, the fact that the EU has established an effective structure for 3 generations of peace in the core of Europe is something that I think a lot of critics of the EU completely allied. Right, that is a massive achievement. There hasn't been Franco-German conflict, but there hasn't been even like a scramble for Iberia or the militarization of Italy, or even the Yugoslav wars were relatively contained and managed. And we got to climb down from the troubles in Ireland. That was only possible thanks to the particular structures of the EU. And the real uplift of material economic reality for hundreds of millions of Europeans, not just Easterners like myself, but Southerners, Portuguese, Spaniards, Greeks before they fucked it up, Irish, right? The level of material well-being and prosperity, which cannot be reduced to they got in on some extractive neo-colonial exploitation of Africa, because a lot of it comes out of productivity gains within the core, technological development, and technological deployment within the core of Europe, not relations between Europe and the global South. All of these are monumental achievements that have saved and improved hundreds and millions of lives. So if we're going to shit all over the EU, that's part of what you're shitting on.
I'm okay with that, because I don't think that will last very long. And I think it has been oncoming for the last 10 years anyway.
It's possible. And I mean, our civilization may not last for very much longer. And that said, right, like, you might miss it when it's over. And if there is, and to a certain extent, right, like, the way in which the European Union and these continental institutions have foreclosed the possibility of, which I think is a rather fanciful one, of some kind of leftist breakthrough in, I don't know, Catalonia, Denmark, right? Like the Italian cantons of Switzerland. I'm not sure where these vibrant local, national level leftist experiments that the EU is theoretically crib-deathed were supposed to happen. But the extent to which they've been prevented also goes hand in hand with the existence of a centralized node, right? Like within Brussels, and a bureaucratic structure, which could be where you get a continental breakthrough towards a leftist reorganization of European society and politics, right?
I have a question
and
on
then
that
you wouldn't
regard.
need to go canton by canton.
What about, is there any basis to an explanation the spread of right reactionary politics within member states of the European Union that has to do with economic integrationism?
There are accounts, yes, that you get revanchism because of the dismantling of the social democratic structures of, you name it, France or Scandinavia or Germany, creating a greater sense of precariousness and a feeling of relative privation that then opens up things to the far right. That's possible. One must ask why it favors so heavily the far right over the far left. And there are cases such as Poland or Hungary where you have the nationalist revanchism under conditions of social democratic improvement and general prosperity, which kind of falsifies the narrative that the neoliberal integration forced by the EU is the thing that's driving the move to the right, because the social democratic prosperity also forced by the EU apparently has the same effect, which unfortunately makes the sort of Rod Dreher-ist this is a reaction to, globo homo style forced cosmopolitan liberalization seem a little bit more persuasive as an explanatory vehicle.
Well, let's just
which gets you to
for a moment, right? Because it's like, it does seem like, I don't want to be too, say, okay, so I think the second point is stronger than the first, but on the first point, why would it favor, the far right? I think there is like other stuff that's happened in the last several decades that might make it hard for the left to, to pick out benefits from this. I think certainly the fall of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc and the sort of demise of the place that the sort of, most fervent hopes for socialism had been invested in. Certainly the fact that even like old social democratic parties that, that might have otherwise benefited from this have politically repositioned themselves by then in ways that made it very difficult for them to benefit on this, that were, in some cases, and, I don't want to exaggerate. You have to look at this country by country, but like in some cases where, we're actually the agents of neoliberalization, so that made it harder for them to, that made it, less likely that they would benefit from it. I do think there are maybe, some, I think there might be some reasons why.
And I also would add to that, I think there might be some other reasons why there's been peace in Europe, aka the fucking nuclear bomb. So just to throw that out there, it's the establishment of this to the productivity of the core, which is fascinating to me as a socialist argument, because not to impugn your social democratic virtues, but
the bad's coming. What's up?
That has been done largely by foreclosing experimentation and limiting how that social democracy can be administered and run its own monetary policy, and that has been shut off even from the EU's own parliament by its constitution. So the fact that it would favor the right as a result of that is pretty fucking obvious. Nonetheless, it did not help that the people who sold this were largely of social democratic parties from Mitterrand forward. And its association as a result of kind of the Keynesian internationalism of the World War II agreements really does put the center left in a kind of bind in regards to larger Europe. It's been able to weather it in places that already had a fairly strong center left tradition, i.e. the Scandinavian countries, but places that have not really developed them in any real sense. They haven't been able to really do anything. They're immediately discredited and voted out of office the moment they try anything.
Well, consider Spain. I would challenge that. Spain has tended to have currently has a center-left coalition, I think. And
no, I think they just chose like a new not center right, far right leader.
Yeah,
the king just
did
mandate to create a government. Yeah.
Well, Portugal then.
Portugal is you got me on Portugal.
Yeah,
Portugal's the case in point. It's and on one hand, it's hard for me. The problem that I have with this is hard for me to see this. Like, let's just create a counterfactual for a second and say that Germany's defeated. You don't have a unified Eurozone. You have kind of two options that could develop out of that. You can have a global nuclear war. You would have had treaties of cooperation emerge anyway, and probably overseen by either the Soviet Union or the United States, regardless, right? So, I mean, in some ways, something like the EU after the results of World War II are almost inevitable. But
well, I mean, we've got both cases, because
okay.
You had the EU, but you also had Comic-Con, and there's a reason we don't talk about Comic-Con.
It took me a second to realize you were talking not about the event in San Diego, but the Soviet-led economic.
It was bound to be LARPing and cosplay after the war, of course.
It's like those seem like really weird points of comparison. But okay.
Yeah, they precisely, right? Like the very fact that one could make that confusion, be mistaken like that, right, proves my point. Yeah. We tried the Soviet socialist style European integration, and it sucked. It sucked for everyone, especially the people who were being integrated. The strongest case for the EU was made in Eastern Europe by the experience of Soviet socialism. And Ben, you're absolutely right that like the association of leftist parties with the Soviet project has been absolutely toxic for leftist efforts in Europe. And that's something that needs to be reckoned with, right? Like, I think it's fine to have a, sentimental, tragic, romantic attachment to the Soviet Union as a glorious but ultimately failed experiment. But an unwillingness to let go of its rotting, zombified, putrid flesh and seek for a new model for a leftist Europe, right?
Well,
a new blueprint.
And I suspect actually, as that sentence ended, that this might be intentional. This is as beautiful a transition as I'm going likely to get. I've been teasing this for a while, but we finally nailed things down with the venue. Bhaskar Sunkara and I and our friend, the Australian economist Mike Beggs, are writing a book for Verso called The Blueprint, about what a sort of feasible and economically viable version of socialism might look like. Having learned what we take to be some of those lessons from the Soviet Union, and our first event, it's not anywhere near coming out yet, but to sort of preview it, is going to be in Chicago on Labor Day. I kind of hate that title because I think the answer really all straightforward to give is no, but forget that. The content.
Good. The answer to that is
can
no.
Lead socialism co-ops work across too?
Yes, exactly. But forget that part. That's I complained about it, and I was told we could clarify that all at the beginning. And anyway, the answers to most questions and titles is no anyway. So, but talk about co-ops, talk about planning, talk about models of post-capitalist society. So that's Labor Day. So that's Monday, September 4th at the Hideout in Chicago. So if you are in Chicago or near Chicago and you want to come see Bhaskar and Mike and I and nerd out about all that, that is 7 p.m. on Labor Day. And as to the putrid, rotting flesh of the Soviet experience and the respects in which, as fatally flawed as that model may have been, the death of it might have been a tragedy nonetheless. And what all that says about the EU and what the left should think about the EU. As fascinating as this has been to watch play out here, like a sort of leftist version of the 1999 Hitchens versus Hitchens debate on whether Britain should
Which
be.
one of us is Peter and which one of us is Christopher is the question. But
You're Peter, Kuba's
You know
Christopher.
you're Peter.
I don't think
Thank you.
confused about this.
fair.
I do want to go back just because this is going to be such a long night regardless. We have such, debate.
Yeah.
It's true.
To the debate. Last thing I do want to give people a chance to just very, very quickly sound off on before we go to after the debate, though, is that as sort of sonorous and highbrow as that presentation was, it did include not one but two instances of something that you always love to see on Twitter, which is, you know what this is just like? Hitler.
Nazism, Hitler. Yeah, of course.
This being the only relevant thing that's ever happened in human history, and so all comparisons are really best as comparisons to Hitler.
Yeah.
Somebody needs to make that Hitler rum mock-up. It's the meme that you just drop whenever anybody resorts to that.
Yeah, fair enough. It does also really drive me crazy because it's like if you really took this analogy seriously, then okay, this wouldn't just militate against the Mearsheimer position. This would also militate against current American and Western European policy. What is this? All this fucking around with arms shipments and economic sanctions. If
Stop treating this like the Spanish Civil War if this is the main show.
Yeah,
right,
exactly.
Definitely. Didn't we learn our lesson from Sudetenland? We can definitely go a little bit.
I will notice that we didn't get we got our argument ad Hintlum twice, but we didn't get our argument ad Chamberlainum twice. So
True. That's also true. Yeah, definitely. I will say that, obviously, this is going to be the seat of contention once we get to the conversation that opens up between them. These claims of Russian imperialism, of course. I don't think that, if I recall, Mearsheimer is really going to bring up the making this analogy is shit in and of itself. He leaves that to the side. But we will see now, as we move into Mearsheimer's opening statements, a difference in style, a difference in focus as well. And, if we spent all of this time talking about the European Union and specific countries within it and all of this nuance, it's going to be gone basically for the rest of it. We will get to issues of regionalism and globalism. But, framing it around Ukraine is a problem for us specifically is a really interesting difference that you're not going to see coming up with Mearsheimer.
Well, let's watch Mearsheimer.
Yeah, Mearsheimer.
Mearsheimer.
Yes, him.
Thank you so much, Karl, for providing us with a very fruitful basis for a discussion. And then, Professor Mearsheimer, I'm happy to give the floor to you.
Oh, that food is like a rotted kumquat, but whatever.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I feel honored to be asked to be here this evening. Let me start by saying that I agree completely with both what Cecilia said and what Karl said about the fact we live in a very dangerous world today. I'd put a finer point on it and say that I think the world is likely to get more dangerous with the passage of time. And number two, I believe that the world that we are moving into is more dangerous than the Cold War was. And of course, the Cold War was dangerous, but there's bigger trouble ahead. Now, the question is, why do I say that? I say that because you have to think about what the world looked like when World War II ended and how it's evolved over time. And you have to think about how the structure of the world has changed, because that tells you a great deal about the likelihood of conflict. When I was born in 1947, it was a bipolar world. There were two great powers in the system, the United States and the Soviet Union. When the Cold War ended in 1989, and certainly when the Soviet Union fell apart in December of 1991, we moved from a bipolar world to a unipolar world. Then around 2017, the structure of the system began to change, and we moved from unipolarity to multipolarity, a world where there are three great powers, the United States, China, and Russia. So if you think about it, in my lifetime, we went from bipolarity to unipolarity to multipolarity. Now, what this means is that in the multipolar world we're in now, we have what I would call two conflict dyads involving great powers. One is the US-China dyad, and the other is the US-Russia dyad. During the unipolar moment, you had no great power competition. Most of you young people in the audience were born in the unipolar moment. There was only one great power in the system in the unipolar moment, and you cannot have great power competition by definition when you have only one great power. In the bipolar world that I was born into, there were two great powers, and you had one conflict dyad, the United States and the Soviet Union. So what you see is today you have a major conflict dyad in Asia involving China and the United States, a major conflict dyad involving great powers here in Europe involving the United States and Russia. That's two conflict dyads versus one in the Cold War and none in the unipolar moment. Furthermore, war is more likely, security competition is more likely to turn into war in the US-China competition and in the US-Russia competition than it was during the Cold War. So what I'm saying to you is that we have more potential wars between great powers in the multipolar world we now live in, right? And furthermore, those wars are more likely. Now, why do I say that? I think what I have to do here is explain to you how I think about the security competition between the United States and China in East Asia. Just tell you what I think is going on there, and then talk about what's going on here in Europe in terms of the US-Russia competition. And of course, when I talk about the US-China competition, what I'm going to do is focus mainly on Taiwan. And when I focus on the US-Russia competition here in Europe, I'll focus mainly on Ukraine. And what I'm going to try and do is convince you that these are really dangerous situations. Now, with regard to US-China competition, what's happening here is that China is a peer competitor of the United States. If you were to rank order the three great powers in the system now, the United States remains the most powerful state on the planet. China is a close second, and there's great fear in the United States that they will eventually overtake us. And Russia is a distant third. Russia is a weak great power. There are a number of people who argue it shouldn't even be considered a great power. People should argue that we're in a bipolar world today that involves just the US and China. I don't agree with that. I think Russia is a great power, but it's the weakest of the three great powers. China's a potential hegemon. It's a potential hegemon in Asia. China is growing very powerful. And in international politics, when you grow very powerful, the ideal situation is to dominate your region of the world. It's to be a regional hegemon and to make sure that no other country on the planet, really no other great power on the planet, dominates its region of the world the way you dominate yours. And of course, the paradigmatic example of this is the United States of America. We are the only regional hegemon in the world. We dominate the Western Hemisphere. No American goes to bed at night worrying about any other country in the Western Hemisphere attacking us. Why? Because we are Godzilla. In the international system, you want to be Godzilla, and you want to make sure you're the only Godzilla on the planet. Well, the Chinese have figured this out. The Chinese want to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. The Chinese know full well what happens to you in international politics when you're weak. They call it the century of national humiliation. It runs from the late 1840s to the late 1940s. They were weak, and when they were weak, they were taken advantage of. You can rest assured that they want to make sure that they are by far the most powerful state in Asia, and you can rest assured that they'd like to get the Americans out beyond the first island chain, out beyond the second island chain, and far away from China. It's the best way to survive in international politics, to be a regional hegemon. And the Chinese are taking all that economic might they have and they're turning it into military might. Now, how are the Americans reacting to this? It's very clear. The Americans do not tolerate other regional hegemons in the system. The 20th century shows this very clearly. The United States played a key role in putting Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union on the scrap heap of history. We had no intention of letting any of those four countries dominate either Europe or Asia. You can rest assured, we have no intention of allowing China to dominate Asia. And in fact, we're not going to pursue a pure containment strategy. We're going to pursue a rollback strategy as well. We're going to try and weaken China the way we weakened the Soviet Union during the Cold War. We have our gun sights on the Chinese. The Chinese, of course, fully understand that, and they're going to great lengths to try to deal with us. And at the same time, as I said to you, the Chinese have a deep-seated interest in achieving regional hegemony. And the more powerful they grow economically, the better off they'll be at developing the military capability to achieve regional hegemony. This is why, of course, the United States is trying to slow down Chinese economic growth. So what you have in East Asia is an intense security competition between China and the United States. And the principal focus is on Taiwan. And Taiwan is a really dangerous situation. There is no analogous situation in the Cold War, the 1947 to 1989 Cold War. Berlin was not the equivalent of Taiwan. Why is Taiwan so dangerous? Taiwan is remarkably dangerous because, number one, the Chinese consider it sacred territory and they desperately want it back. Number two, the Americans believe firmly that for a variety of reasons, it's important that we not let China take Taiwan because it has great strategic value for us. So what's happening here is that the United States is now moving closer and closer to Taiwan. The Nancy Pelosi visit's just one indicator of how we're moving closer and closer to Taiwan. And this, of course, enrages the Chinese because this is sacred territory. This is nationalism at play. The Americans are preventing us from getting Taiwan back. So you have a lot of tension. And then the third reason is it's easy to imagine a Cold War in East Asia turning into a hot war over Taiwan because it would be a battle over an island in a huge body of water. During the Cold War, when Karl and I were young, it was hard to imagine starting a war in Central Europe because you had two massive armies with thousands of nuclear weapons in their inventory. And if those massive armies crashed into each other with all those nuclear weapons, we probably would have all gotten incinerated. So when we ran war games during the Cold War, it was very hard to get a war going in Europe because everybody understood what the consequences would be. It's much easier to imagine a war breaking out over Taiwan. It's a small island out in the middle of a large body of water. And by the way, the other 2 points of friction in East Asia are the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And you can imagine a war breaking out over those 2 bodies of water. So you see the different scenarios between the Cold War, Central Europe, and the new Cold War in East Asia between China and the United States over Taiwan or the South China Sea or the East China Sea. So there's big trouble coming in East Asia. I'm not arguing here that war is inevitable, but it is going to be very difficult to avoid that intense security competition turning into a real war. Okay, let's shift gears and go to Europe and talk about what's going on in Ukraine. And here we're focusing mainly on the US-Russian dyad. And it's very important to understand that the Americans drive the train in the West. Putin doesn't want to talk to the Europeans. He wants to talk to the Americans. He knows who the boss is. Right? So when you think about the war in the Ukraine, it's really the US and the Russians that matter the most, in addition to the Ukrainians, of course. Now, the conventional wisdom in the West is that what is happening here is that Putin is an imperialist, and he is bent on creating a greater Russia or recreating the Soviet Union. And what he is intent on doing in Ukraine is conquering that country, occupying that country, and integrating it into a greater Russia. And in fact, Ukraine is the first stop on the train line. When he's done with Ukraine, he's going to move on to other states like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, maybe Poland, who knows. But he is an imperialist at heart. He's an aggressor who's interested in building an empire. This is the conventional wisdom that you all know well. I would imagine that most of you believe this. My view is this is simply wrong. There's no evidence to support it. I believe that if you're going to make that argument, you have to show evidence that Putin said it was desirable to conquer Ukraine and create a greater Russia. You have to show evidence that he thought it was feasible to do that. And you have to show evidence that he said that that's what he was doing. There is no evidence, and I want to underline that word, no. There is no evidence that he thought it was desirable to conquer Ukraine or to create a greater Russia or to conquer any other country. There's no evidence that he thought it was feasible. And there's no evidence that he said that's what he was doing. Furthermore, he does not have the capability to do it. The Russians invaded Ukraine with 190,000 men. There's no way 190,000 men could conquer a piece of real estate with 40 plus million people in it with 190,000 men. When the Germans invaded Poland in 1939, they went in with 1.5 million men. You need a huge army to conquer a country like Ukraine, occupy it, and incorporate it into your country. And you're not going to do that with 190,000 men. Furthermore, this man, Vladimir Putin, does not have the Wehrmacht at his fingertips. You've noticed how poorly the Russian army performs. So you have a small army that's not the Wehrmacht. There's no way this army could conquer all of Ukraine. And if you look at the strategy that's been employed, my argument makes perfect sense. This is not a case of Putin acting like an imperialist. My argument is, as I'm sure many of you know, that if you look carefully at what was going on, it's quite clear that the West's efforts to turn Ukraine into a Western bulwark on Russia's borders was viewed as an existential threat, the brightest of all red lines, as Bill Burns, the ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Moscow at the time, said, by the entire Russian elite. The idea that Ukraine was going to be incorporated into NATO, the idea that Ukraine was going to be incorporated into the EU, the idea that you were going to promote an orange revolution and turn Ukraine into a pro-Western liberal democracy, it's unacceptable to the Russians. It was an existential threat. You might not think it was an existential threat, but what you think doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is what the Russians think. And the Russians thought it was an existential threat. And they made it unequivocally clear to us that it was an existential threat. And how did we react? We ignored what they said, and we continued pushing to bring Ukraine into NATO, pushing to bring Ukraine into the EU, pushing to turn it into a pro-Western liberal democracy. Why did we do that? I'll tell you why we did it. Because the Russians were weak. That's what happens when you're weak in international politics. The Russians protested NATO expansion from the get-go. The first tranche took place in 1999. The second tranche of expansion took place in 2004, right? The Russians screamed bloody murder both times. We didn't care. We just shoved it down their throat. They were weak. And when they're weak, you can do that. 1999, we succeeded. 2004, we succeeded. Then in 2008, we said, we're going to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. The Russians made it very clear, you're not going to do that. You're not going to do that. We're going to resist. And if we have to, we'll destroy Ukraine. This was clear a long time ago. What did we do? We doubled down. We just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And what you want to understand is that from the Russian perspective, this is an existential threat. They have to win this war. They cannot afford to lose it. If you accept the argument that Putin is an imperialist and he's just bent on conquering some more territory and creating a greater Russia, and there's no really underlying security imperative, then you can cut a deal and end this war. But if you think that the Russians view this as an existential threat, you think about this conflict in very different ways. Because you're dealing with a great power that's armed to the teeth with thousands of nuclear weapons that sees itself facing an existential threat. Now, that's my view of the Russian perspective on how this has to end. They have to win. They cannot afford to lose. What is American policy and what is Ukrainian policy? American policy is we're going to beat them in Ukraine. This is, of course, Western policy. Norway is deeply involved in this. Our policy is to defeat the Russians, right? And also wreck their economy with sanctions. And also promote regime change and then put Putin on trial. And maybe even break apart Russia. This is their goal. We're going for victory. We think we can win in Ukraine. Putin has to win. We think we can win. And the Ukrainians, it's an open and shut case. Of course, from their point of view, they want to recover all their territory. And they want to weaken Russia as much as possible so that Russia can't pay a return visit. So the Russians are pursuing a clear-cut victory. The Ukrainians and the Americans are pursuing a clear-cut victory. What does this tell you? This tells you there's no diplomatic solution. There's no diplomatic solution to this one. This is why everybody basically understands that this is going to be a protracted stalemate, right? Or at least they think it's going to be a protracted stalemate. They think it's going to be a protracted stalemate because there's no solution. There's another dimension to this, the most worrisome of all, and that's nuclear escalation. Russia thinks it faces an existential threat. And again, what you think doesn't matter. It's what the Russians think. They think they face an existential threat. What happens if NATO succeeds? What happens if we begin to roll the Russian army back in Ukraine and we're moving up to the borders of Russia? When I say we, I'm talking about Ukrainian forces backed by NATO power. The Russians are likely to use nuclear weapons to rescue the situation, right? This is a great power that's facing an existential threat, and it's losing. You don't think it's going to think seriously, at least, about using its nuclear weapons? You can rest assured it is. I like to tell the story about 1945, Japan, 1945. The Americans had defeated Japan by August 1945. Japan was defeated. We just couldn't get the Japanese to throw up their hands and surrender. And we thought that we were going to have to invade the Japanese home islands. And we knew how many casualties there had been at Okinawa and at Iwo Jima, and we did not want to invade the Japanese home islands. We were desperate to avoid invading the Japanese home islands. And you know what we did? We dropped 2 nuclear weapons on Japan. And you know what? You could do that because the Japanese didn't have nuclear weapons of their own, and they were not going to retaliate. Well, I have news for you. The Ukrainians don't have nuclear weapons of their own. And if the Russians use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, Ukraine can't retaliate, and we're not going to initiate a general thermonuclear war by using nuclear weapons to defend Ukraine. So you can see the potential for nuclear escalation here is real. And given the consequences, the potential of escalation does not have to be very high to scare the living bejesus out of you. Right? So you want to understand there's a perverse paradox here, which is the more successful we are in waging the war against Ukraine, the more likely it is that they'll turn to nuclear weapons. Not to say they axiomatically will. It's just to say it becomes a real possibility. So the story I've told you here, in conclusion, is that during the Cold War, we had one conflict dyad. During the unipolar moment, we had none. During the multipolar world we now live in, there are 2 potential great power conflicts on the table. And both of them, as I tried to describe, are very dangerous. So all of you should be very fearful about the world that you live in, and even more fearful about the world that we're moving into.
All right, now that we're all feeling very afraid, I think we're going to practice progressive stack and start with the most Eastern European person here. Kuba, what are your thoughts?
I think that he makes one of the common errors, or he's got one of the common blind spots of the IR scholar, which is the end of the conflict doesn't necessarily, the end of an international conflict doesn't necessarily come out of an international framework or out of the international dimension. He's setting up this case where there's a durable Russian state and a durable Western state, or a Western sort of supra alliance of states that are the 2 actors. And it's basically a chess match, right? I just watched the Queen's Gambit, so I've got that on my mind. And
Love that show.
Yeah, also had a nice Cold War spin on it. And right now, the U.S. is doggedly moving, right? Like neither side can opt for a draw. The United States is doggedly trying to checkmate Russia, but if you push them too far, then they'll just knock over the whole chessboard. and he makes a very good point that, like, if Russia does escalate to using nuclear weapons, then will the U.S. actually risk strategic annihilation over the Ukrainian endgame? And the rational calculus would strongly suggest that they wouldn't, that they would just, it would be Hitlerans all the way to the bottom, but you would accept the order that the Russian state had forced. I think it's much more likely that the resolution to this conflict doesn't come from the behavior of the state structures, but from the behavior of actors subsidiary to them that will transform the state structures that they're in. And we saw a little taste of that with Prigozhin's move on Moscow. There are figures within Russia and within the West that have the capability of shifting the interests and strategic preferences of their entire side from within. Another possible.
Well, let's just pause on that for a second, because in the world where Prigozhin had somehow he'd just, let's say this was his goal, and he was capable, and he had the capacity, and in a world where he'd somehow gone in like a 3rd century Roman general and taken Moscow and put himself in charge. Do you think he would have withdrawn entirely from Ukraine, or I mean, what how do you see?
I didn't think he might have accelerated the war, actually, but what do you think, Kuba? It's hard for me to read what he would have done given his statements, and we'll never know now, as he had it.
Well, Prigozhin,
as in weird statistical fluke, he had a plane crash, but yeah.
The likelihood is not that Prigozhin goes in and makes peace. The likelihood is that by arriving at the outskirts of Moscow, Prigozhin precipitates the collapse of the Russian state as it is currently construed. That allows for a tactical breakthrough by the Ukrainians, as demoralized Russian forces don't have supply, don't have logistical support, and begin to get routed out. And the focus within Russia of the security services is reestablishing command and control over the center. And that's the end of the war, right? It's similar to the abdication of the Tsar and the mess that eventually leads to the Bolshevik breakthrough being the end of a very long and messy, but that is what precipitates the end of World War I. Similarly, you could have the Western coalition fall apart through the election of far-right figures in certain crucial Western powers, right?
AKA France.
AKA France, or, Trump Part 2 might be basically, Putin, as long as you give me what I need to jail Joe Biden and everyone else who's been mean to me on Twitter, then you can have as much of Ukraine as you can take, and we're going to cut off all the arms shipments and everything.
Which is not impossible, although it's also worth mentioning that this would be quite a reversal of his previous policies. That this is, everybody always forgets this, but Trump as president was way more aggressive in pursuing the rivalry with Russia than Obama had been, certainly. From everything from Syria to opposing the pipeline to sending much heavier weaponry to Ukraine.
This is true, and the election of a figure like Trump might not lead to an organized peace agreement with Russia. It might also lead to a breakdown of command and control and coordination within the Western alliance, to the point where the Russians get their ability to make a tactical breakthrough.
Or hell, while we're throwing counter narratives out, it could also lead to a military junta in the United States. Who knows? Like,
Well, yeah, that's true, and exactly and those are conditions in which you get a resolution outside of the stalemate that doesn't come from the international security environment, which is, I think, where Mearsheimer, falls short in his analysis. Right, he can't go into the black boxes of the state structures to look at possible. He can't imagine that third dimension of politics being the way that you get out of this of these defensive lines, right, of the static formation.
Which it's so okay. So that's a fair point. I mean, it certainly could be. I mean, like if especially given that the war might last for a really long time, which it currently kind of feels like, then like absolutely an internal change in one of the actors could, change the interstate dynamics. That all makes sense. But sort of bracketing that assumption, I mean, like, do you basically think that that what he's laid out here is correct, or if not, I mean, what are the sort of places you'd put question marks?
So I basically think that Putin is more a realist than an imperialist, and as a result, Mearsheimer's framework doesn't necessarily apply everywhere and in all cases, as much as realists would like to do that. But I think that he has captured the Russian security dilemma quite elegantly, and he is describing Russian foreign policy in a way that, for me, is much more cogent and in better alignment with the facts than the Hans Blix, Karl Bildt position. And I think if there's a weakness, it's that when he talks about, the West just kept pushing and pushing during the period when Russia was weak, NATO expansion just crammed down their throats, that is an under-theorized and shallow account, because, and this came up in the comments, the people who were really pushing for NATO expansion were the Poles,
right,
the Balts, the countries that remembered the Comic-Con, not the good one in San Diego,
right,
wanted some tangible guarantees that they would get out of there. And he also has difficulty envisioning the possibility that you might have a more enlightened security structure coming from that moment of possibility, such as the end of the Cold War,
right,
where I really think that in a more responsible world, you would have you could have had somebody like George H.W. Bush drawing down NATO, right? And instead shifting more security concerns to multilateral bodies like the UN. Maybe, we'll never know how fanciful that notion is, right? But that was an alternative to perpetual NATO expansion. And frankly, George H.W. Bush seemed to have much more cautious instincts than Clinton and the presidents that followed him.
right.
Yeah. I think that's all pretty good stuff. If we're going to get into the downsides of Mearsheimer, a lot of that falls again into his version of realism, the neo-realism or structuralism, which I think it's too limited. It lacks certain variables that, say, classical realism has to offer, which is, for example, placing things in a historical context. You're not really going to hear him speak about siege mentality in Russia, and you're not really going to hear him speak about why Poland has the particular kind of memory that would lead them to want to join NATO, and thus it's always just going to be purely an issue of power to a degree that I think is a little bit, it has its blind spots. Mearsheimer has
certainly like it's. I mean, you don't want to go so far in rational calculation of actors' motivations here that you miss that it's entirely possible for great powers to do things that are wildly irrational and undermine their own interests, which it seems to me that, like, you know, there have been a bunch of examples of, certainly on the U.S. side, and I mean, like, one of the things that kept hitting me during the discussion about NATO expansion is like, man, you know, if your goal is to not want this alliance to spread, then good job, right? I mean now you
go ahead.
Oh, you were saying?
No, I'm just to sign off on that. I mean, Mearsheimer himself predicted that Russia would not invade anything beyond the two separatist republics.
That's exactly the second issue that I was going to bring up, is that I think there's a pretty good descriptive power, and I think his kind of analysis is a good tool in that way. But in its ability to predict what's going to happen, he's failed, and specifically with Russia. Mearsheimer does this thing where it's like, this is the way things work, and also this is the way things should work. Therefore, this is always going to be, you know, the outcome. And the weird thing is that, in getting into what's based and not based about him, is his version of realism, and I think a lot of realism in general, has a certain deference to imperialism and to the status quo, which is obviously not kind of things that we can particularly get behind. I also think that there is a certain level of rationalism that we should assign to Putin and his motivations, just like Kuba said. And I think it's important to be able to recognize the rational drives behind different actors, state actors in the world. Otherwise, we're going to have an even more difficult time trying to figure out how they're going to behave in any particular setting and how to approach them. But I don't know. Why does a country go against its national interest in your mind, Ben?
I mean, it's a very good question, but I mean, I think part of it is that national interest is one of those things that's like a little bit like that Engels line about how about historical materialism, that it's that the material factors are decisive in the last instance. That the last instance gives you some wiggle room for the fact that things are weird and messy and multi-causal. And so similarly, even if you think there's some sense in which IR realism captures something that's important in that last instance sort of way, these are also decisions that are made by human beings.
Right.
And I think that,
and how those human beings came to power is got to be important to some degree, right? Like, I think Besner said really nicely that one of the problems with realism is that it black boxes politics in the name of geopolitics, and there's got to be something to that, which is a bit detrimental.
Yeah. It was Kuba more recently, right? So yeah, that's definitely. I think that's definitely right, and yeah, I think that, like, in fact, a lot of times, to the extent that these larger scale factors are decisive, it's because you have some kind of feedback loop where people do things that, you know, sort of go beyond them, and they get slapped down for it in one way or the other, right? So, like, that's, you're going to, I mean, I think there's like a probably, I would expect, that people on the panel know much more about this than I do, but I mean, I expect that there is a middle course between the sort of view that I think Schmier had kind of correctly described and was correctly dismissive of, that this invading Ukraine was supposed to be the first step on a world tour of Hitlerian conquest, or even that the ultimate goal with regard to Ukraine was to just completely end its nationality and just absorb it entirely into Russia. I think he's right to say that that's wrong, but there's also I think that there's like a view in between that and saying that like Putin was making an entirely rational decision here, that that there was that initial push to Kyiv, and it's it seems not crazily implausible to me that he might have underestimated just how hollowed out the Russian military was when he made some of these early decisions. It also, it's not like great powers don't sometimes send entirely inadequate military forces to do what they're trying to do. I mean, see Iraq, right?
Or Afghanistan anytime in the last century, not just when the Americans did it. Like,
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Mearsheimer and the realists treat romanticism and that kind of the passion of war as something that only nationalists and liberals are liable, are vulnerable to. But
right.
The Kissingerian type stone cold lizards, they just get the math correct, right?
Wasn't he called an eccentric realist? Like, clearly he had a little bit of a war boner going on.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the same kind of miscalculations that have to do with the vanity of an aging alpha male, bureaucratic information chimneys that lead to poor information in the hands of decision makers, willful blindness to negative realities, and
right.
The underestimation of non-great power peoples. These are the same kind of miscalculations that rationalists can do within Mearsheimer's framework, and therefore, why not have dumb wars for smart geopolitical reasons? And no matter how based a justification you can produce ex post facto, right? You're still stuck in a dumb war.
Yeah, and it does seem. I mean, it does seem like a very dumb war, and one that's like already brought about some things that were really contrary to some of the original goals of it, right? I mean, I'm pretty sure nobody, Mearsheimer's obviously correct, and importantly correct. It's really important he makes this point that this like paranoia about Ukraine being drawn into the Western sphere through NATO or the EU, or both, or what that could mean for Russia, is not some eccentricity of Vladimir Putin. This has been like a consistent view of the entire Russian elite for as long as this has been an issue.
It's a glaring red line, not just because Putin is insane, right? Like, it's still a matter of national interest.
I mean, there's a reason why George Kennan advised George H.W. Bush not to do what was done explicitly, and that the Rand Corporation was the opposing force there, advising him to try to break up Russia into 3 different countries. And that's a real debate that really happened. And I think that's, we don't know what was promised to Putin by George H.W. Bush. We really don't know that. To Gorbachev, or to Yeltsin, we have no idea. But we do know the debates after it, and in that sense, from a realist point of view, fair. I think one of the issues with Mearsheimer is that when we're often dealing with him, frankly, he's debating institutionalist idiots, and so he looks better. He is dancing around Karl Bildt, quite literally. But I want to point out some of the things in his own.
It's very animated.
In his own analysis that we're like skipping over.
Yeah.
One is he admits that Russia, if their success was to get even worse than it was in 2022. And again, the conditions on the ground are actually quite different now. Then we might end up, there might have been a nuclear exchange. But when he's talking about China, for example, that isn't even brought up as a possibility, even though those are arguably even more likely scenarios.
I think he will a little bit later, just to clarify that in the opening statement, it wasn't there. That's true.
No, but it just from the structure of the parallelism, I actually listen to what is said and how an argument is structured. If you bring up something like that, I mean, he does mention that we're in a dangerous scenario, but I happen to have seen him also talk to Australia recently, where he was openly advocating that he should be trying to get the Australians on the side of the U.S. in an upcoming war with China, which he thinks is very much necessary.
Yeah. So I think that I did. This is good because I did want to I want to get back to the debate very soon, but I did want to pivot to China just a little bit because one of the things that I think a couple people in the chat rightly pointed out is that one of the odd things, and I'm not sure how much of this was just kind of a rhetorical choice or what was going on here. One of the odd things in Mearsheimer's description of China-Taiwan dynamics is that he sort of made it sound like the only, that the big motivation on the Chinese end was just sort of, I don't know, culturalist, that it was
it's sacred territory, and not, for example, a strategic island used by Japan to invade the mainland in the past. I don't know, I mean, is it sacred territory to him because it's sacred? Is it sacred territory to him because it represents the existence of the Kuomintang against the communists? Like he doesn't bring any of that up. And what I find interesting, again, when he's talking about Russia, I think he's quite accurately breaking down what is likely the rational actor thought process. When he's talking about China, he makes them sound both like rational actors sometimes, and then like irrational people who are willing to do something because of sacred causes on another, and it just goes back and forth. And I think that exposes part of what the agenda is here. And it's interesting because I was actually thinking about this in his structure of the argument. Bildt barely brought up China at all. It was like 2 sentences.
Sure.
And that is where Mearsheimer starts, seemingly because that's where he thinks we need to have an important parallel, and this is really important to emphasize. Whereas for Bildt, it's like, oh, well, yes, we understand there's a concern that America has about us shooting war with Taiwan. And yes, the Chinese might have concerns. And that's about it. That's all you get. So, like, the terms of the debate, I hesitate to call this a debate, actually, because right now I feel like there's a compound thesis, and it would be very hard for us to pick what side we were siding on or what's even being fucking argued. But it is, I found that interesting. And I say this because when people talk about Mearsheimer, they talk about a lot about his, very, I think, usually pretty astute compared to what else we're hearing, breakdown on Russia. But we're not hearing about his breakdown on everything else or how he fundamentally views the world, except that he throws around multipolarity a lot, which has become a buzzword that people seem to like. And people seem to like it as a good, as opposed to just a descriptor. One of the things that's interesting about this is Mearsheimer basically gives the complete idiot's guide to imperial British geopolitics in 19th century, which, by the way, predicts that a bipolar world is the most stable world and that a unipolar world or a multipolar world are inherently unstable.
Well, let's let them get into the weeds on that a little bit, because in the coming section here, we're going to see actual debate. They're going to be speaking to the same points in a moderated fashion. So I think we'll get into the issues of polarity a little bit there, and a few more of Mearsheimer and what's his name's Bildt's biases. So
all right. Sounds good. And I should say, too, that this is normally about when we would go to the post game for patrons, but tonight, just because this is such a long debate and we want to get in at least a little bit of this in the mid show, we're probably going to wait to go to the post game until about half past the hour. So let's go back to it now.
Take.
Does it matter?
Take the same.
You're in the middle.
I'm in the same.
In the middle, yes.
The middle.
Please. Now, thank you very much to both of you for a very disturbing, I must say, presentations. Now, the subject of today's debate is how the geopolitical crisis influenced the power of deterrence and prospects for a new global security order. But let us start in Europe, and then we will zoom out afterwards. And before we venture into this uncertainty of the future and even of the present, let us go to one issue where I know that your analysis and your statements, which you have repeated here, is seen as very provocative in Europe, namely the why of the Russian invasion and the Russian aggressive stance towards Ukraine. And I would invite Karl to have some initial reactions to what John has said.
And I can do that, but let me start by saying that at least there's one issue where we do agree. We live in a more dangerous time. Power relations are shifting, different competing interests are there, it is less predictable, it is more dangerous. On that, we do agree. And there was an element of agreement also on the China analysis. We could go into that further. But on, obviously, the Ukraine-Russia, we do disagree. I mean, to me, it's abundantly clear. If you read what Mr. Putin said, as I said, he was very explicit in his speeches that setting up Ukraine was not only a mistake, it was worse than a mistake. It was unacceptable. Its old Russian land should never have been allowed by Lenin to set up this Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And then he said, didn't make much of a difference, he said, because I mean, Stalin ruled it with an iron hand anyhow, but Stalin did the mistake of not taking away the formal structures of Ukraine. And the second mistake was allowing it independence. This is, as he said repeatedly, ancient Russian land. There's no question he wants to get rid of Ukraine. I don't think he wants to create the Soviet Union. His ideal is sort of Ivan the Terrible. It is Peter the Great. It is Catherine II. That's his Russia. And he wants to recreate that. It's not only Ukraine, it is undoubtedly Belarus as well. So his intention is abundantly clear in the speeches that he gave immediately before and immediately after the invasion. Then John said that, well, he didn't have the resources to do it. That's fairly obvious by now, agree. But we should be aware of the fact that when he attacked on February 24th, he attacked with 90% of the combat potential of the Russian army, 90%. So he would clearly, and he attacked from the north in order to get Kiev, biggest city, from the west to get Kharkiv, second biggest city, from the south to get Odessa, the third biggest city. He attacked with missiles every single major center across the territory of Ukraine. It was not some sort of Sunday expedition by some Russian forces who had got lost in the woods. It was an all-out invasion. It failed due to the fact that the Russian army was less competent than he thought, and as a matter of fact, substantially less competent than most of us thought. Because even the Western intelligence agencies who said he's likely to invade thought that he was going to finish the job in a week. He believed that as well. We know a fair amount of his political preparations. He believed he could do it in 1 or 2 weeks. The Ukrainians proved otherwise. But then on the background, John, I can understand that. You're nothing wrong with Chicago, but that's where you're coming from. So your perspective tends to be the Americans are all over the place and Europeans and others not really to that extent. It wasn't really, and I've written a book about it. I was there. It wasn't really the Americans pushing. I mean, we Europeans went to Washington and say, you have to care about Europe as well, not only be obsessed by China. If there were anyone's pushing, Poles pushed in order to become members of NATO. The Ukrainians were knocking on our door all the time. We want a closer relationship with the European Union. We want to be part of the West. It wasn't the West going east. It was the East wanted to go west in order to get more of the security, the prosperity that they rightly or wrongly associate with the European Union and indeed NATO. And Americans were fairly reluctant in the beginning. If you take the entire crisis that led up to the first invasions, first the Crimea one and then the Novorossiya ones in 2014, the Americans were fairly absent from the scene. They were fairly absent from the scene because they were engaged in other things. It was the Ukrainians pushing, and rightly so, in my opinion. Then finally, just the Russians considered it an existential threat with Ukraine. Why on earth would they consider it an existential threat? I mean, that's pure fantasy land. I wouldn't disclose, I wouldn't deny that there are, Mr. Patrushev and others, but we should take them out of that. If they consider their neighbors to be existential threats, they're going to be the one invasion after the other. There's no way that Ukraine is going to invade Russia. No one has ever thought in those particular terms. You said that Americans live peacefully. Yeah, Canadians are not going to invade. The Mexicans are not going to invade. You live in peace. There's no reason whatsoever why Russia and Ukraine should not be able to live in peace if just Russia gives up its imperial ambition.
What is your answer to this, John? How would you respond? Where are the smaller European states that sought protection from NATO and the EU once they had the opportunity when Russia was weak in the early 2000s, late 1990s? Where are they in your analysis? Wasn't this also small?
I'll answer your question, but I also want to deal with some of the points that Karl made. There's no question that states in Eastern Europe that were outside NATO wanted in. I don't blame Ukraine for wanting in. My point is we don't have to accept them. There's no rule that says just because somebody wants to be in NATO, that we have an open door policy and we take them in.
And you didn't with Ukraine.
I actually don't believe that at all. We have actually doubled down.
They are not members of Ukraine, and no one has.
You have to let me answer the question.
Yes, sorry.
You raised a lot of excellent points, and I want to deal with them. But I think that if it's clear that the Russians view Ukraine in NATO as an existential threat, you should not admit Ukraine to NATO or push to admit Ukraine to NATO, because the end result is what you have today. We, in effect, pursued a policy that is leading to the destruction of Ukraine. If we had not attempted to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border, with NATO expansion, EU expansion, and the color revolution, but especially NATO expansion, there'd be, in all likelihood, no war in Ukraine today. Crimea would still be part of Ukraine, and certainly those 4 oblasts that the Russians annexed would be part of Ukraine. But I just want to go back to a couple points that Karl raised. First of all, I've gone over in great detail every one of Putin's speeches, press conferences, and his writings. And the argument that he was bent on incorporating Ukraine into Russia is usually said to be outlined in a famous article that he wrote on July 12th, 2021. You can easily find this article on the internet. And he did say many of the things that Karl said about how it was regrettable, how Lenin set up the Soviet Union, and so forth and so on. He does not say in that paper that he is interested in conquering Ukraine, that it's desirable to conquer Ukraine, or that's what he intends to do. In fact, if you go look at the article, and this is the article that almost everybody points to, you should go read it. He says that he recognizes Ukrainian nationalism. He says that he recognizes Ukrainian independence, and he says that the future of Ukraine is up to the Ukrainian people. That's what he says in the article that everybody points to is the key piece of evidence that he was out to conquer Ukraine. As I said to you before, I can find no evidence that he thought he could conquer Ukraine. Just a word or two about capabilities. He had 190,000 troops. It was almost all of his army, as Karl pointed out. You're not going to conquer a piece of real estate as large as Ukraine with an army that small. And he might have dropped bombs on Western Ukraine, but you can't conquer and occupy a country with bombs. You need ground forces to do that. He didn't have the ground forces. He never even attempted to conquer one half of the country. At most, he attempted to conquer 1/3 of the country. He just didn't have the capability. This was not the Wehrmacht. Even with regard to Kyiv, he could not have conquered Kyiv with the forces that he had. It was just too small an army. He wanted to threaten Kyiv, but he couldn't conquer it. Now, just one final point, and then I'll turn it back to you, Cecilia. Karl said that if you look at what happened over the past few decades, it's a case of the East moving West and not the West moving East. I don't know how you could make that argument with NATO expansion. Of course it's the West moving East. NATO expansion, EU expansion, the color revolutions. Where were the Russians moving westward? The Russians weren't capable of launching a military offensive in the 1990s. They were so weak, and then Putin comes to power in 2000, and over time he resurrects the Russians. He brings them back from the dead, but they don't have the military capability to go on the offensive. As you know, in the August 2008 military campaign in Georgia, the Russian army performed terribly. Right? They just don't have the military capability. There's no evidence that the East is moving west. It's the West that's moving east. And this is what presents an existential threat to the Russians.
But what about if you go back to 2007? That is when Putin, in his speech in Munich, announced that in his view, the multipolar world was already arriving. Now, in your presentation, you said 2017. That is 10 years later. So isn't it a possibility that Putin, from that moment on, has that in mind as he goes forward from 2008 and then interprets things
No,
differently?
the famous Munich speech in 2007 that Cecilia is referencing is where Putin first makes it manifestly clear that he is angry at the West for their policies, which he thinks do not take into account Russian interests. But he does not indicate that he's going to rectify this problem by going on the offensive and attacking any country in the world. What sets off the real trouble is the April 2008 decision at Bucharest. This is the NATO summit at Bucharest, April 2008, where NATO says at the end of that summit that Georgia and Ukraine will become part of NATO. It's no accident, ladies and gentlemen, that in August 2008, you had a war in Georgia, and then starting on February 22nd, 2014, conflict broke out in Ukraine, right? That's what was driving the train here. And by the way, just one final point before I turn it to Karl. Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy were adamantly opposed to bringing Ukraine into NATO at the April 2008 Bucharest summit. And Angela Merkel has recently said that the reason she opposed bringing Ukraine into NATO is that she understood, listen to these words, she understood that Putin would interpret it as a declaration of war against Russia. That's in April 2008. But what did the Americans do? The Americans steamrolled her and they steamrolled Sarkozy. And they kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And it all blew up in their face on February 24th of this year.
All right. I want to pause it there for a bit since I want to go to the post game for patrons to finish this up in about 15 minutes. And I want to give us all a chance to do a little bit more talking before that happens, before we kind of get into the meat of what has been said in the moderated discussion so far. There was a request from Jay in the chat earlier. We had it up for just a little bit more about whatever these terms about unipolarity, multipolarity, bipolarity that kept being thrown around. What all that actually means, and kind of what you could read to sort of have a better grasp on what's being discussed here. And so I did just want to throw that to you guys before we kind of got into Mearsheimer.
Kenneth Walsh and John Mearsheimer are themselves classes scholars on this, as are Karl Bildt and William Wolfert. The origins of the terms come from international relations theory and geopolitical theory in the late 19th, early 20th century in the British Empire. It was really picked up in the 1950s and 60s for analyzing the situation between the USSR and the United States, and then later on the USSR, the United States, and China as a separate sphere. I guess there's other places to read. Multipolarity has been picked up by everybody from Sarid Zakaria to Alexander Dugin. Ben Norton is a contemporary who uses him a lot, as is Michael Hudson. The people who agree on multipolarity are not actually necessarily in political agreement at all. And that's another thing to remember, because multipolarity is quite popular on the right and on elements of the left, including people who have some influence from things like world systems theory, which I'm not going to go into very deeply because that's another set. That's a kind of political economic form of doing this kind of a analysis on the relationship between states and internal to states. So it's a little bit different than international relations theory. One of the things that I think this is, I'm going to let Kuba and Jordan, because they're actually also both schooled in this, obviously, talk in a second on sources. But one of the things I want to do to pivot as a very quick point, because I think I'm going to be quiet till we get into the post game after this, is that I find Mearsheimer quite interesting in being and acting like he's surprised that small Eastern European nations would appeal to an alternate polar power, because his own work actually indicates that is almost inevitable.
Yeah.
Of course, like from his work, of course, Lithuania and Ukraine are going to appeal to the U.S., and then Bolivia and even Colombia are going to appeal to China or Russia. That is perfectly predictable, because you want the hegemon you're economically attached to be far away, so it's not likely to militarily dominate you too. Like that's actually like a logical conclusion.
Realism 101.
Yeah, it's like basic shit. So I was surprised when he was pretending to be all, because as my personal opinion here, that's the one point Bildt's made that I think is good.
He has the classic great power apparatchik mentality of, hey, Moscow, hey, Beijing, keep your bitches in order, right? Like that the only centers that matter are the great powers, and one of the most fundamental responsibilities of being a great power is to throttle any ability, any autonomous political movement within your periphery or within your alliance system that might threaten systemic balance. And I think that for all his talk about, a liberal democracy this, liberal democracy that, he doesn't really like the fact that liberal democracy in the subordinate nations may lead to destabilizing moves on the part of their elites from an overall geopolitical perspective.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I did just want to jump in and say is, I mean, obviously this is the point I'd make, a constant preoccupation of stuff that I have done and written since 2018 has been that I want people to be better at making distinctions between which questions are descriptive and which ones are normative, right? Which are questions about how the world actually does work, and which are questions about what we want to happen. And I find on a lot of this multipolarity stuff, there's a lot of confusion about that in both directions. So I think that some of the, like, when Mearsheimer talks about multipolarity, I don't actually mind that much. I think he's sort of just giving he's just kind of giving an account of what's happened. And I think that his normative takeaway is like mostly reasonable, that like, as the United States is interacting with the world, it's a mistake to, it's potentially really disastrous to act as if it was still the only great power when there are these other ones, and you have to take that into account. Fair enough. A lot of the left enthusiasm, or left adjacent maybe enthusiasm, and that's not me being obnoxious or trying to excommunicate people. I'm trying to get people's own self-description right. Like, I think some of the like gray zone and ex-gray zone people wouldn't even necessarily claim to be like socialists or anything like that, right? They would, so hence left adjacent. But like, I think a lot of those people, when they, start talking about multipolarity, you get the sense that they think this is a really normatively good thing in ways that oftentimes really confuse me. Because just crassly, imperialism is bad, but the difference between having a single imperial power kind of running the show and having a few different ones jockeying for influence doesn't strike me as obviously better. I mean, it could have local consequences that are better in certain places, but could also have local consequences that are a lot worse. I mean, it seems like not unlike the distinction between having a single cartel running the drug trade in a certain area and being crazy and ruthless and, chopping up anybody who asks too many questions and leaving them on the side of the road. Bad. But a few different cartels fighting for the same territory and blowing up gas stations, not necessarily better, right? That's that seems like maybe something that, like, on a normative level, it's hard to get enthusiastic about in either direction. And then when it comes to stuff, when it comes to the other end of it, which also finds its expression on the left, people who sort of have this view that it's because Russian imperialism is bad, and I'm just using the word imperialism loosely here. We don't have to get into a whole thing about what counts as according to Hoyle imperialism. Because Russian imperialism is bad, therefore it's anything that like therefore assisting Ukraine against it is good, and and in fact, if you have any worries about escalating great power conflict, that's bad, etc. Like, to the point about how small, of course, less powerful countries are going to seek distant patrons against the more threatening local great power. Of course, that's going to happen. To a certain extent, you might be happy that it happens, right? I mean, I'm glad.
Historically, however, it does increase the likelihood for war. Like that.
Well, there's that. Yeah.
And you want to, and that's the thing too. It's like, look, in some cases you might be happy that it happens, right? I'm glad that Haiti is independent. It might not have been if Spain wasn't, didn't for their own reasons support that, right? Fair enough. But also, look, I'm glad that the Soviet support for Vietnam and its, justifiable struggle against American imperialism never escalated to a point that would have led to war with the United States, right? I mean, like, that's a, like I think just sort of going from like, well, we like imperialism, we don't like imperialism, and etc. Like, and just sort of like missing these important points about how the world actually works, I think can lead you to some very bad places.
Right. I want to throw in there that I think that the issue at hand really is not like we like imperialism, we don't like imperialism, but people who believe that multipolarity will solve some problems for the third world in particular are saying that out of a hatred for American imperialism in particular. So any sort of, conflict, competition for American hegemony is going to inevitably be a good thing, is not something that we can necessarily derive just from multipolarity itself. There are, benefits to unipolarity, there are benefits to bipolarity, there are benefits in certain ways to multipolarity, but to think that having a wealth of hegemons to shop basically as a small country.
That's the thing. In multipolarity, hegemons are shopping you.
Exactly, but to think that I don't know, I really don't think that Haiti is going to get a particularly better deal in a multipolar situation if, let's say, China is going to come to them. Maybe to a degree with certain infrastructure, but literally only if it's going to be beneficial to trade with China, not out of any
also to the extent that China is even able to penetrate that far into the Americas. For instance, the United States could give Taiwan the offer that Taiwan received after 1949 because it controlled the Pacific all the way up to the Chinese littoral. China would have to forget the second island chain. It would have to breach the Panama Canal and get into the Gulf of Mexico if it was going to develop that sort of relationship with Haiti. So even if multipolarity were a global fact of the system, that doesn't mean that Haiti actually gets to, as Jordan was saying, shop its hegemons. No, ultimately, you have to look at regional power dynamics as well.
Yeah, I would like to intervene for the children in the audience, which is most of them.
Seriously, things are getting a little bit crazy here.
For one, the idea that any of these arrangements has inherently an internal structure that is inherent to anything other than a particular state's hegemony assumes that all states are interchangeable, including their political economic apparatus. To bracket that out is frankly fucking idiotic. Two,
here we go. Spleen's going to be removed right now.
There is a distinct way in which when people say multipolarity in these scenarios is likely to increase the chance of war, there are alternate versions of multipolarity. Well, that won't happen. But assuming that just because of the fact that there are multiple hegemons, that things will work out better for people, ignores the entire history of the 18th and 19th century. And you have to actually look before your most recent preoccupations to understand that. The Monroe Doctrine itself is a product of multipolarity. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand the foundations of U.S. imperialism happen under a multipolar guise, which, by the way, is why Lenin took such particular stances in 1913, 1914, and 1915, including calling for the excommunication of people who backed national liberation movements in Serbia against the British Empire because it was in the interest of inter-imperial competition in what we would now call a multipolar world.
Yes.
And if you do not know that history, you should shut up.
Well,
or
just ask questions and read books.
Yes. It's
calling people neocons or not leftists for speaking literally about the point that Ben was making earlier is that we have to be able to understand the descriptive and the prescriptive, positive just definitions of things and what that actually means in terms of outcomes. And there are a ton of variables here, none of which necessitate any particular outcome.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think there's a section of particularly the online left that would have thought that Eugene Debs was controlled opposition because he criticized the Kaiser in his anti-war speeches, where the truly which made him half a neocon, and like the truly based thing to do would be to just uncritically support whoever happens to come into conflict with American empire. But yeah, I mean, I think you can. Yes, my friends in chat, you don't necessarily need to shut up, but you should read, and you should maybe pause to ask yourself, is given everything else I know about the person who's speaking, do I think that that's probably what they mean? Is it likely that this just became a pro CIA podcast in the last 2 hours, or could something else have been going on here? In any case, on that note, we are going to go to the post game for patrons to finish this up. Might take just a minute in case anybody needs to go to the bathroom or smoke a cigarette. But after that, we'll be right back on. Looking forward to the rest of it. A lot more to say about the China piece in particular. Yeah, I don't know. Left is best.